You are now watching Man's Dark Nature, where true crime meets the truth behind the silence. Here, we explore unsolved murders, recently reopened cold cases, and twisted domestic crimes that continue to haunt families and investigators alike. No jump scares, no sensationalism, just the dark, unsettling facts that the world tried to forget, delivered through careful research and unflinching investigation. This is where forgotten cases find their voice, and where the darkness reveals its secrets. May 27, 1991. Milwaukee police officers John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish responded to a 911 call about a naked, bleeding 14-year-old boy running through the streets. What they didn't know, what they refused to investigate, was that the boy was nonverbal because Jeffrey Dahmer had already drilled a hole into his skull and poured acid into his brain. Instead of saving Konerak Sinthasomphone, these officers became accomplices to murder when they personally escorted the child back into the hands of his killer. Within half an hour of police leaving the apartment, Dahmer murdered Konerak by strangling him, performed oral sex upon his corpse, and dismembered him. This wasn't just a mistake, it was the culmination of 13 years of systematic police incompetence that enabled one of America's most notorious serial killers to operate with virtual impunity in Milwaukee's most vulnerable communities. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes. It's the story of how law enforcement agencies repeatedly, consistently, and deliberately failed the victims, allowing a monster to feast on the marginalized while they looked the other way. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't just happen to kill for 13 years. He was enabled by a criminal justice system that treated certain lives as disposable. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer confessed to killing 17 young men between the ages of 14 and 28. 11 of the victims were black, and most were lured with promises of money or sexual experiences. This wasn't random targeting. Dahmer understood exactly what every predator knows. The system protects some victims more than others. He deliberately preyed on gay men, men of color, and those living on society's margins. People whose disappearances wouldn't trigger intensive investigations, whose families' pleas would be dismissed, whose lives the system deemed expendable. Some claimed that the fact that Dahmer had escaped detection for so long showed that Milwaukee police attached a low priority to investigating the disappearance of victims who were homosexual or members of racial minority groups. This wasn't an accident or oversight. It was systemic discrimination that created the perfect hunting ground for a serial killer who understood the rules of institutional racism and homophobia. By 1991, Dahmer had perfected his technique. He would lure victims to his apartment with promises of money, drug them, assault them, kill them, and then dispose of their remains. He had been doing this for over a decade, and the system designed to protect citizens had not only failed to stop him, it had actively helped him continue. Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree wasn't just enabled by police incompetence, it was strategically planned around it. He understood that law enforcement in Milwaukee operated with clear biases, and he weaponized those prejudices to continue killing. The evidence of systemic failure was overwhelming even before Konerak Sinthasomphone's murder. Dahmer had multiple encounters with law enforcement that should have exposed his crimes years earlier. In 1988, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a 13-year-old boy, Konerak's older brother. Instead of facing serious consequences, Dahmer served just 10 months in prison and was released on probation. Just 2 months after his first victim disappeared in March 1989, Dahmer successfully escaped a prison sentence for child molestation by telling the judge that he was desperately seeking to change his conduct. The system not only failed to protect future victims, it actively enabled Dahmer's continued access to them. During his probation, Dahmer's parole officer should have been monitoring him closely. Instead, the visits were perfunctory, and despite multiple red flags, including complaints from neighbors about smells and noise, no serious investigation ever occurred. The system had multiple opportunities to discover Dahmer's crimes, but each time, institutional apathy and discrimination prevented justice. Dahmer also understood the geography of indifference. He deliberately chose apartment buildings in areas where police response would be minimal, where complaints would be ignored, and where the disappearance of marginalized residents wouldn't trigger intensive investigations. His apartment became a killing field because the system allowed it to become one. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 17 people between 1978 and 1991, but understanding his crimes requires understanding how law enforcement's deliberate ignorance enabled each murder. The killing began in 1978 with Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker whom Dahmer lured to his childhood home. After killing Hicks with a dumbbell, Dahmer dismembered the body and scattered the remains. This first murder established Dahmer's method: target vulnerable individuals, use his charm to gain their trust, kill them in private, and dispose of the evidence. But it was Dahmer's move to Milwaukee that revealed the true scope of law enforcement failure. Starting in 1987, complaints began pouring in about apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments. Neighbors reported horrific smells, strange noises, and suspicious behavior. The media would later publish the grim details of the murders and methods of disposal, but during the killing spree, these obvious warning signs were systematically ignored. Glenda Cleveland, Dahmer's neighbor, made multiple calls to police about disturbing incidents involving Dahmer. She witnessed him with young men who appeared drugged or distressed. She reported the horrible smells coming from his apartment. She begged authorities to investigate. Each time, her concerns were dismissed or minimally addressed. The most damning evidence of police complicity came with the case of Konerak Sinthasomphone. On May 27, 1991, the 14-year-old boy ran drugged, naked, and bleeding from Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer's neighbor, Glenda Cleveland, called the police and insisted that they investigate Dahmer. When officers Balcerzak and Gabrish arrived, they found a child who was clearly in distress, unable to speak coherently, bleeding, and exhibiting signs of severe trauma. Any competent investigation would have immediately recognized this as a serious crime. Instead, the officers believed Dahmer's story that this was simply a domestic dispute between adult lovers. The police were unaware that the body of another victim was still inside Dahmer's apartment when they accompanied them back. Had they conducted even the most basic search, they would have discovered evidence of multiple murders. Instead, they personally delivered Konerak back to his killer and left without any follow-up investigation. The Konerak Sinthasomphone case represents the most egregious example of police failure in American criminal history. This wasn't just negligence, it was active participation in murder through willful blindness. When officers Balcerzak and Gabrish arrived at the scene, multiple witnesses were begging them to take the situation seriously. Glenda Cleveland and other neighbors explained that they had seen the boy running in terror from Dahmer's apartment. They pointed out that he was just a child, clearly drugged, and in desperate need of medical attention. The officers' response revealed the depth of their prejudice and incompetence. They treated the situation as a nuisance call, showing obvious disdain for the concerned neighbors. When Dahmer arrived and claimed the boy was his 19-year-old lover, the officers accepted this explanation without question, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The failure to properly investigate was systematic. No ID check. The officers never properly identified Konerak, who was actually 14 years old, not 19 as Dahmer claimed. No medical assessment. Despite obvious signs of serious injury and drug impairment, no medical personnel were called to evaluate the child. No background check. A simple check would have revealed Dahmer's conviction for sexually assaulting Konerak's older brother just 3 years earlier. No apartment search. Had officers conducted even a cursory search of Dahmer's apartment, they would have discovered evidence of multiple murders. No follow-up. After delivering Konerak back to Dahmer, no welfare checks or follow-up investigations were conducted. The audio recordings of the officers' radio communications that night reveal their true attitudes. They made jokes about the situation, used homophobic language, and expressed relief at getting the intoxicated Asian male back with his sober boyfriend. The callousness was breathtaking. Cola Stiles, another witness who called 911 on Dahmer 2 months before his arrest, later said it took 17 years to forgive herself for not stopping him that night. The community members who tried to save Konerak lived with guilt that should have belonged to the officers who failed in their duty. What makes this failure even more damning is that it wasn't isolated. This was part of a pattern of willful indifference to crimes against marginalized communities. The Milwaukee Police Department's handling of missing person reports from the gay community and communities of color was consistently inadequate, creating an environment where predators like Dahmer could operate with impunity. The end of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree came not through competent police work, but despite police incompetence. On July 22, 1991, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards agreed to accompany Dahmer to his apartment for $100 to pose for nude photographs. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noted a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor. When Edwards responded to Dahmer's request to turn his head and view his tropical fish, Dahmer placed a handcuff upon his wrist. What followed was a desperate fight for survival that Edwards won through courage and quick thinking. Edwards managed to punch Dahmer and escape from the apartment, running into the street with handcuffs hanging from his wrist. Police found him wandering the streets and Edwards led them back to Dahmer's apartment. When officers entered apartment 213, they discovered a house of horrors that revealed 13 years of police failure. A forensic examination of the apartment turned up 11 victims. Body parts were found in the refrigerator, freezer, and throughout the apartment. Polaroid photographs documented Dahmer's crimes in gruesome detail. The body parts found in Dahmer's refrigerator and Polaroid photographs of his victims became inextricably associated with his notorious killing spree. The evidence revealed not just the scope of Dahmer's crimes, but the comprehensive failure of every system designed to protect the public. Beginning in the early hours of July 23, 1991, Dahmer was questioned by Detective Patrick Kennedy about the murders he had committed and the evidence found at his apartment. Over the following 2 weeks, Kennedy and Detective Dennis Murphy conducted numerous interviews with Dahmer. During these interviews, the full scope of law enforcement failure became clear. Dahmer detailed how he had operated for 13 years, how neighbors had complained repeatedly, how he had multiple encounters with police, and how the system's indifference had enabled him to continue killing. Each revelation was an indictment of institutional failure. Dahmer faced 15 counts of first-degree murder. Following a 2-week trial, Dahmer was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The Milwaukee Cannibal would never kill again. But while Dahmer faced justice, the system that enabled him remained largely unchanged. The officers who delivered Konerak Sinthasomphone back to his killer faced minimal consequences. John Balcerzak and Joseph Gabrish were initially fired from the Milwaukee Police Department, but they successfully appealed their dismissals and were reinstated with back pay. Even more outrageously, Balcerzak was later elected president of the Milwaukee Police Association, the union representing Milwaukee police officers. The man who had personally delivered a child to his death was rewarded with leadership of the very organization supposed to represent law enforcement professionalism. This outcome revealed the true nature of the system that enabled Dahmer. It wasn't just individual incompetence, it was institutional protection of that incompetence. The message was clear: officers could participate in the most egregious failures imaginable and still advance their careers within the system. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was killed in prison by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver during a work detail. Scarver would later claim that Dahmer's behavior in prison, including shaping food into body parts, had made him a target for violence. The tragedy of Tracy Edwards' story didn't end with Dahmer's capture. Edwards was unable to return to the life he'd once known, and was later arrested multiple times for drug possession, theft, property damage, bail jumping, and eventually murder. The hero who stopped Jeffrey Dahmer became another casualty of the system's failure to protect and support victims. The aftermath of the Dahmer case revealed how institutions protect themselves when their failures are exposed. Rather than conducting genuine reform, the Milwaukee Police Department and other agencies engaged in damage control that prioritized reputation over accountability. The Sinthasomphone family filed a lawsuit against the city of Milwaukee, seeking justice for the officer's role in Konerak's death. The case highlighted not just individual officer failure, but systemic problems within the department. However, the legal system that had failed to protect Konerak also failed to deliver meaningful accountability for his death. Internal investigations into the Dahmer case were largely superficial, focusing on individual failures rather than the systemic issues that enabled 13 years of killing. No comprehensive review was conducted of how missing person cases involving marginalized communities were handled. No significant policy changes were implemented to prevent similar failures. The media coverage, while extensive, often focused on the sensational aspects of Dahmer's crimes rather than the institutional failures that enabled them. This allowed law enforcement agencies to frame the case as the story of one uniquely evil individual, rather than a systemic breakdown that had deadly consequences. The true tragedy of the Jeffrey Dahmer case lies not in the crimes themselves, but in how preventable they were. Each of Dahmer's 17 victims represents a failure of the system designed to protect them. Konerak Sinthasomphone was just 14 years old when he was killed by Dahmer. His death was entirely preventable, not just on the night of May 27, 1991, when police delivered him back to his killer, but years earlier when his older brother's assault should have triggered intensive monitoring of Dahmer. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, Jamie Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strader, Errol Lindsay, Anthony Hughes, Oliver Lacey, Joseph Breithoft. Each name represents not just a life lost, but a system failure that enabled that loss. These weren't faceless victims. They were sons, brothers, friends, and community members whose disappearances should have triggered intensive investigations. Instead, they were dismissed, forgotten, and abandoned by the very institutions sworn to protect them. The Jeffrey Dahmer case should have been a watershed moment for American law enforcement, a clear demonstration of how prejudice, incompetence, and institutional indifference can enable the worst crimes imaginable. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about how systems protect themselves rather than the people they serve. The officers who failed Konerak Sinthasomphone faced minimal consequences and continued their careers. The departments that enabled 13 years of killing implemented cosmetic changes while maintaining the underlying cultures that created the problem. The prosecutors who failed to adequately punish Dahmer's early crimes faced no accountability for their role in enabling future murders. Most tragically, the communities that suffered under this system's failures continued to suffer. The institutional prejudices that enabled Dahmer's crimes, racism, homophobia, classism, remain embedded within law enforcement agencies across America. The same attitudes that treated Dahmer's victims as disposable continue to shape how police respond to crimes in marginalized communities. The real crime in the Jeffrey Dahmer case wasn't committed by Dahmer alone. It was committed by every institution that had the power to stop him and chose not to. Every ignored complaint, every dismissed concern, every failure to investigate made the system complicit in murder. The tragic case of Konerak Sinthasomphone not only highlights a significant failure by the police to recognize the imminent danger he was in, but also underscores a broader issue of community and police inaction that contributed to this oversight. When we examine the Jeffrey Dahmer case through the lens of institutional failure, we see that the real monster wasn't just the man who killed 17 people, it was the system that enabled him to kill them. The officers who delivered a child back to his killer, the departments that ignored community pleas for help, the prosecutors who gave light sentences to dangerous predators, the parole officers who failed to monitor their charges, all became accomplices to murder through their deliberate indifference. Jeffrey Dahmer was eventually caught, tried, and convicted, but the system that enabled him was never held accountable. The officers who participated in Konerak Sinthasomphone's murder through their incompetence were reinstated and promoted. The departments that ignored years of complaints implemented no meaningful reforms. The prosecutors who enabled early crimes faced no consequences for their failures. This is the real lesson of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. In America, individual monsters are punished, but the systems that create and enable them are protected. The institution of law enforcement, designed to serve and protect, became a shield for predators who understood exactly which victims the system wouldn't protect. Until we acknowledge that Jeffrey Dahmer's 13-year killing spree was enabled by institutional failure, not just individual evil, we remain vulnerable to the next predator who understands how to exploit the system's prejudices and blind spots. The monster is gone, but the system that created him remains largely unchanged. And somewhere tonight, another predator is learning the same lessons Jeffrey Dahmer learned, that in America, some victims matter more than others, and the system designed to protect everyone will abandon some to protect its own reputation. That's the real horror of the Jeffrey Dahmer case. Not just what one man did, but what the system allowed him to do, and continues to allow others to do, through its willful blindness to the humanity of society's most vulnerable members. The darkness reveals its secrets slowly, but it always reveals them. If this story found you in the shadows, subscribe and let me know in the comments. What truth do you think we missed? Until the next case goes cold, stay vigilant.